The Torngat Mountains is a place whose beauty is without equal. Treeless and rugged, it folds its way up the Labrador coast. For over 70 centuries, the Inuit and their predecessors have made this region their home. Having been systematically moved off the land, the path to creating this park has been a long and at times difficult one.
I was just 2 years old when we moved away from here.
It must be understood that the Inuit society will not go away.
As the park charts its path forward in one of the most remote corners of Earth, the story is by no means finished. These are the Torngat Mountains, and this is Torngat Mountains National Park, Inuit land. Aboriginal people have lived, fished, and hunted in this region for over 7,000 years. Their presence here for centuries was as integral as the mountains themselves. Yet today, this land has no permanent Inuit settlements. All but the artifacts from an era gone by remain.
So here we have a sod house, and I'm standing right now in the entranceway. So imagine that the sod house would have had walls built out of sod. On the inside of the walls to support the sods were whale bones. And the whale bones would have came up and met at the top like that and all around. And the sod would have been put all around that.
The story of the Torngat Mountains National Park is a story of a nation redefining its relationship to Aboriginal people. The story weaves together the Nunatsiavut Inuit from northern Labrador, the Nunavik Inuit of northern Quebec, and both provincial and federal governments of Canada. It is an imperfect narrative that started in 1969 and didn't see resolution until 2005. After nearly 40 years of negotiations, the foundations for establishing this park were finally made concrete.
So if you can imagine now that this bay back in the 1800s up to the early 1900s was just full of Inuit.
This land has been used by Inuit for thousands of years, and really with no destruction to it.
Well, this park, before it was park, was and is an Inuit homeland, first and foremost.
The Torngat Mountains National Park is 9,700 square kilometers of beautiful Arctic wilderness. Nain is the park's closest community in Labrador, 200 kilometers to the south. A remote northern landscape, travel in and out of the park is challenging. Charter Twin Otter flights departing Goose Bay into the park must land at an old North Warning radar airstrip in Sagalek Bay. Visitors then board a longliner boat to travel to base camp. All visits to the park start with base camp.
Base camp itself, in terms of its composition, is a real mix of Inuit, Western science, scientists, tourism, you name it. Everything that can happen in a national park happens at this base camp. It's the central hub for everything that happens out of the national park here.
We decided to pilot the concept of a base camp adjacent to the park to see how that might help combine a bunch of agendas, and in particular, finding ways to encourage people to visit the park.
Called Kengidluasik, base camp is situated in St. John's Harbor in Sagalek Bay, just outside the southern boundary of the park. Open from late July to late August, the staff here can house and feed up to 85 visitors at one time. For the most part, visitors here mean scientists. This place is a hot spot for analyzing a host of the planet's ongoing troubles. Mornings are busy at base camp.
Ahoy there, mateys.
Today, Sam Bentley and Tanya Brown load onto Joey Anuduk's boat for a week of mapping sediment on the Nukfuk Fjord floor.
Here we go.
Trevor Bell needs to be airlifted from his camp onto one of the Torngat Mountains glaciers. Trevor has been studying the changing masses of glaciers in the park over the past quarter century. Derek Whitaker and Wan Li Wu will leave camp for the day and head into Rama Bay to establish a long-term permafrost monitoring site.
We can try down here. I mean, there's all these smaller lower terraces too. There's a whole series of benches here.
A bear monitor must accompany each team that leaves base camp. Bennett Barber shadows Wan Li and Derek as they head to Rama Bay to do their work. A bear is spotted from the helicopter on the approach.
Polar bears present a unique challenge and safety issue for visitors to this park. The safest way to travel on the land is to travel with people who know the land and grew up here.
Polar bears is quite a threat. They're known to be quite territorial and very, very dangerous, you know. You really do need a polar bear monitor with you in these parts. These guys really help, you know. They got a lot of knowledge. They know this land like the back of their hand.
Under Bennett's watchful eye, Derek and Wan Li get to work on measuring the depth of the permafrost layer.
I'm here to protect the people from black bears, polar bears. Scared off before it comes too close and comes to get too used to.
Gravel and possibly permafrost is about 48 centimeters at this spot, Wan Li. Seems like there's a bit of a gravel bed here. One of the reasons that permafrost is important is because it limits the growth of plant roots. So by measuring the depth of what we call the active layer, which is the zone that thaws each summer, by keeping track of that, we can keep track of an important growing condition for plants in this environment.
The hope with this park is that as well as offering its visitors an experience of the land and the people that live upon it, it will also become a destination of choice for scientists and their research.
It's an opportunity for them to do research in a really interesting cultural and biophysical environment, and to do their research through an Inuit cultural lens.
As awareness for the park grows, it's still too early to tell how much science can glean from the area. Though south of the Arctic Circle, the Torngat Mountains are the southernmost example of Arctic ecology in the eastern Arctic. As such, they offer an advanced look at the effects of climate change on Arctic regions. Trevor Bell has been studying glaciers in the park for a quarter-century.
I think it's important to sort of try to understand how sensitive these glaciers are and what their future are. These are the only glaciers on mainland Canada east of the Rocky Mountains. And they're the most southerly of all of the glaciers in the eastern Arctic. So we should really be looking at these as a sort of a bellwether of what may be to come in the responses of the environment to climate change. One of the local people told me that their name for glaciers in Inuktitut is never melting ice when you translate it. And so they were laughing last year saying that they're going to have to change the name of glaciers.
But environmental change is not only evidenced high on the glacial plains, but deep in the floor of the ocean and fjords. Researchers Sam Bentley and Tanya Brown begin the process of cataloging the effects man is having on the marine ecosystem. Both Sam and Tanya's work here and throughout the park pulls up the ocean floor and looks at its contents. Through the layers of sediment deposited on the ocean floor, Sam reconstructs the history of environmental events that have taken place in the park.
We're conducting a marine biological and marine geological survey of the fjords in order to learn about the present ecological conditions in the fjords and also the past environmental conditions and environmental changes that have occurred over the last decades to past few centuries. The most effective storage of environmental information comes from sediments that are washed from the streams into the floor of the fjords. And every year, the floods bring down a new layer of sediments. They carry with them everything from pollen grains to organic compounds, whether they be natural or human introduced. So these layers constitute effectively pages in a book. So as geologists, we can look at the layering of the sediments, of the stratigraphy in the sediments, and page by page peel back layers of history to learn about patterns of change by looking at these layers of sediments, which are derived from the rivers. So the volume of sediment is controlled by the amount of freshwater discharge, and the content, the chemical content of the sediment is controlled by the environmental conditions on the land. So it's an excellent archive of the history of the landscape, and that's preserved in the sediments of these fjords.
By cataloging the health of the organisms that live on the seabed and those that feed off them, Tanya can construct a picture of how healthy the environment is here.
So we're looking at benthic habitat mapping. What benthic means is that we're looking at any animals living on the seafloor, and we're basically trying to get a baseline assessment of what's living in Nuqfuq Fjord. And we're going to be creating habitat maps. So to create the habitat map, you need to know the substrate and you need to know what's living, the species that are living within the substrate or on the substrate.
For their time in the park, Sam and Tanya work off a longliner owned and captained by Joey Anuduk. Joey's knowledge of these waters and this landscape runs deep. His grandmother was born and raised here. This knowledge is invaluable to the researchers.
Now, from my perspective as a marine scientist, the best thing that I can have is a knowledgeable local sea captain. And Joey's been working in these waters for many years. He knows it well. He knows the tides, he knows the currents, he knows sediment types, he knows a lot of what to expect about the sea state in the various areas.
Fishing and hunting have been the mainstays of Inuit life for centuries. Caribou, seal, whale, and the Arctic char have all provided food, clothing, fuel, and shelter for their life on the land. Evidence of Inuit existence here is muted and not immediately visible to the eye. Aboriginal people have occupied the land that is now the Torngat Mountains National Park for thousands of years. It was the arrival of European missionaries to the shores of Labrador in the 1700s, coupled with the provincial and federal governments of Canada, that pulled the Inuit off this land.
When the Moravian missionaries came in, it was their policy to try to get Inuit into southern places because they found it too expensive to operate up this way and to offer services. For the Moravians, they wanted to centralize Inuit into communities so that they could convert Inuit into Christianity and follow Christian rule. Because of that, there's no Inuit living in the park anymore.
The settlement at Hebron, south of the park's border, was established as one of the first Moravian communities. Inuit lived in these settlements from 1830 to 1959, when the Canadian government relocated its population into communities further south. This area in northern Labrador was first considered as a potential national park in the late 1960s. However, at the time, the focus for the Inuit was resolving land claims agreements in the area. For the moment, the park would have to wait. As time passed, old wounds healed and new relationships were forged, and the potential for working together to establish a national park seemed possible.
Establishing Torngat Mountains National Park is part of the land claims agreement for the Labrador Inuit. And it is also part of a land claims agreement with the Nunavik Inuit. So the creation of this park was possible only because Inuit from northern Quebec and from Labrador consented to have this area become a national park.
With the coming of major developments, we've always found that we need to find ways to protect it the best that we could. And one of the ways that we had to think about is how we're going to protect an area that will not be ever developed in the way that is destroyed and never to be the same again. And the national park seemed to be the obvious answer.
In December 2005, final steps were taken to complete the establishment of the Torngat Mountains National Park.
And through all of that, we managed to keep our own sense of identity, being that we are Inuit, no matter what kind of imposition is imposed on us. Is something that any government, any religious order cannot take away from us.
Family and community have always been at the center of Inuit life, and this sense of community is infused in all that goes on here at the park. Looking forward, it is the youth who must ultimately feel the sense of connection to the past and to their heritage if the community is to stay strong. Elders pass along knowledge from one generation to the next. With this in mind, staff at the park have built a youth program that invites young Inuit men and women from the surrounding communities to the park for the summer months to to work with scientists and to reconnect with the land of their ancestors.
Part of what we do within our research programs is we make it a goal of ours to build capacity. This year we hired 11 youth, 2 from Nunavik, and then 8 from Nunatsiavut, and then 1 from the south. And for the past 3 weeks, they've been working with the research programs and alongside other Inuit from the coast that are working with the research programs. So it gives an opportunity for youth to experience research, but within their own cultural context.
I might actually want to go into biology now after the 2 summers I was here. It's just interesting. I never ever realized how interesting it could be.
A lot of the stories that the students take away from here are about research, but a lot of them are about their culture and about their history and about the stories they've heard from elders. So it's a real opportunity to use research as a tool to build connections between Inuit and their past and Inuit and Western science.
As the sun nears the horizon, a group of students visits an Inukshuk in Nukfuk Brook, a traditional land route between Quebec and Labrador. The stone cairn was placed here in August 2009 to celebrate a shared history of the Nunavik Inuit and the Nunatsiavut Inuit. Visiting the Inukshuk, the students are connected with their past and the traditions of their ancestors.
So it's a nice gaining of knowledge to be here in this community.
You show your young people, here's what you do and here's how you do it, and here's how you pass it on. It must be understood that the Inuit society will not go away, and if that can be recognized, we're moving forward in big steps.
It's our wish to be able to have Inuit come back in and set up their Alutsimivit, which is seasonal camps, so that people can actually see that this is not only a park where you see the rock and everything's pretty static, but you're into a park which is living and telling and showing Inuit culture.
Fundy National Park is a small coastal patch of rugged wilderness in southern New Brunswick. At just 206 square kilometers, the park is surrounded by communities and various industries, fishing on its coast and logging inland.
We are a small park embedded in really a very heavily used industrial forestry landscape.
The fish are in serious trouble, especially the area's unique salmon species. Most of the salmon leaving the park to feed aren't coming back. It's a fight for survival, but not one limited to only salmon.
I think we've caused such havoc in our oceans that we've had entire ecosystem shifts.
While some issues have them looking outside the park, others keep their attention focused within it. Fundy National Park is a forest-encrusted jewel in the Canadian Maritimes. Sitting on New Brunswick's Bay of Fundy coast, the park is heavily influenced by the bay's tides, the highest tides in the world. Every 12.5 hours, the ocean rolls in, bringing water levels up to 16 meters, the equivalent of a 4-story building. At low tide, the beach in the summertime is a marvel to be explored.
So this is called a blue mussel, and it actually attaches itself with all these filaments to the rocks so that when the tide comes out, it doesn't get swept away. So it anchors itself, and if you pull on it just a little bit, you'll actually see it kind of bring up all these rocks.
The park itself is a beautiful small park nestled on the edge of the Bay of Fundy. It has that coastal ruggedness with the tides being a main drawing feature. And then off inland, you have the highlands.
This densely forested area has a long-standing history with logging.
About 70% of the park had been cut over at one time or another. There was quite a number of logging dams and splash dams throughout the park. Right behind us here, there was the community of Point Wolf, which was a small logging community.
Evidence shows that logging took a heavy toll on the water system here. Some parts were clogged and others scoured by the moving wood, leaving a legacy of slowly recovering rivers and a few relics of an era gone by.
Here we are 60 years later, and the forest has recuperated. The forest, in some areas, we do have single species stands, but that's just part of the cycle of regenerating. But we do have a healthy forest inside the park.
But outside the park, the lumber industry is a mainstay for many.
Initially, that was one of the main industries, cutting wood for building ships. And it's basically continued to this day with sawmills and pulp mills.
Logging isn't the only industry surrounding the park.
Whether it's urban, small communities, farming, blueberry farms, there's a whole number of uses of the land around us. So, you know, a lot of our stress comes from our very small size.
What's in the park is protected, but it's not enclosed. Animals like fish come and go freely. And this creates another set of challenges.
The two main rivers here in the park, the Point Wolf and the Upper Salmon, we only control a small portion of the lower ends of those watersheds.
The ocean is the bigger unknown factor. The Atlantic salmon in the area are unique in the world. They're known as the Inner Bay of Fundy Atlantic salmon.
Unlike other salmon, which go on these very long sea migrations to the Greenland Sea or the Norwegian Sea, these salmon, for some reason, seem to stay much more localized once they leave our rivers and they go to the stay in the Bay of Fundy or the Gulf of Maine and don't go on these long migrations.
This population of salmon has evolved to return to these rivers in the fall to spawn. But lately, that hasn't been happening. The salmon haven't been coming back.
In 1985, we were estimating that there was about 45,000 adults returning to the rivers in the Inner Bay of Fundy, including the two rivers here in the park, the Point Wolf and the Upper Salmon River. After 1985, something seems to have changed drastically in the ocean. We're not sure exactly what.
In only 15 years, the number of returning adult salmon dropped from 45,000 to a mere 200.
Realizing that the population was in severe difficulty, we decided we needed to put the patient on life support. So we captured as many of the remaining juvenile salmon as we could in our rivers, put them into this special program that we call the Live Gene Bank program at the Mactaquac Biodiversity Facility, where we raise and spawn these fish on a very complex breeding program.
Some of the salmon stay here in this Department of Fisheries and Oceans facility outside of the park to breed and keep their species alive.
This is a female salmon. You can tell by the head. It's a lot more rounded. You see it's got no long nose. And see how big it is, and look at the girth in the belly. She's filling out with eggs.
Some fish are kept in the facility. Thousands of others are returned to the park in the spring and fall. Without this life support system, there would be no more salmon left in Upper Salmon River.
So we're having great success at that, but the problem still remains. Once these fish leave our rivers to go to the sea to feed, they're still disappearing in the ocean.
These bay pens hold salmon who are migrating out of the park's rivers in the spring. Researchers want to see if these salmon will be better adapted to return if they're reared in a controlled saltwater environment.
There are several things about a site like this that you can probably see are much more natural than a hatchery setting to start with, including natural light and storm patterns, temperature patterns that they would all be exposed to. Of course, being in a net pen is not as natural as swimming around the bay on their own, but very likely a step ahead from a concrete tank in a hatchery.
And hopefully, by having been raised in the ocean, they're going to, have a better understanding of what it takes to, to survive out there, and that they'll be successful and come back and spawn, and that, eventually we'll have a self-sustaining population.
By late summer, park researchers are already on the lookout for returning salmon. Today, like almost every day, they're not finding any. And whatever's going on in the ocean to the park's south is affecting more than just the salmon. Fog banks are a common feature of the coastal landscape in Fundy National Park. The fog creates a cool, moist environment which influences all who live here. People, mammals, plants, birds, and fish.
So the simple fact that if you're an aquatic species in this country, you're 5 times more likely to get listed as a species at risk and go extinct than if you're a terrestrial species. So we've got problems in our waters.
The ocean is like a big black abyss. The salmon leaving the park aren't coming back. The American eels are in trouble too, and they're the most widely distributed fish species in North America.
It's prevalent in waters anywhere from Niagara Falls through the Great Lakes into the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence, as far north as Greenland and as far south as about Mexico.
Despite their reach, fewer of the newly hatched eels are making it back to Canada. They're now listed as a species of special concern.
Yeah, that's good.
Some think the problem boils down to where the eels are thought to spawn, in the Sargasso Sea in the Caribbean.
And it's believed that the spawning location is a strategic location whereby the larvae get carried passively by the active transport of the ocean currents back to the coastal areas with which they survive. And this is also one of the areas where the eel might be having a problem because the currents in the ocean seem to be changing, and it might be either taking them longer to transport to their areas where that could affect their survival, or they might not be getting distributed as far because of the currents.
They'll mature in steps. From the larva stage, they transform into glass eels, and then become elvers as they make their way upstream.
And one of the reasons eels are so widely distributed is because glass eels and elvers are able to climb up wet surfaces. And upon reaching their target habitat, these elvers are then known as yellow eels, which is the stage that I'm studying here in the park. We'll push the net back, and while I'm doing that, I pull it up so that it forces them with gravity to go to the front. And then once they're at the front end where the bunt end is, then we can put them into a bucket.
The eels spend a long time in their yellow puberty stage and are suspected to move through all parts of the river system.
In Canada, the yellow eel stage lasts for about 19-20 years, and at a certain point, they actually undergo another transformation into a silver eel.
Once they gather their catch, they'll bring the eels back to the lab for testing and tagging.
And it is 38.8 centimeters. And the eel weighs 85.06 grams.
Beyond taking basic measurements, they insert a tag to better understand where the eels are going while they're in the park.
And the tag gets inserted into the cavity.
So the smallest egg is up here in the dorsal. And then if we look on the other side of him, that is the antenna, comes out the side of him.
Once we have those tags in the eel, we have antennas set up across the river. And when the eel passes through the antenna, it can tell us which individual passed and which time of day that the eel actually passed. And we can use that information to determine their movements as well.
For now, these eels will feed and fatten up, building up their energy stores. They'll have a long, treacherous journey ahead of them in the ocean.
If we lose the eel, we don't know what effects this might have on the food chain or on the ecosystem. The eel is an opportunistic feeder, and they feed on a lot of different organisms in any of these systems. And it's also an important commercial fishery here in Atlantic Canada, so that's on the verge of collapsing if the eel does disappear.
The researchers here know that given the right conditions and time, populations can rebound. They saw it firsthand with the peregrine falcon. Years ago, they were endangered. Now they're only threatened.
Here at the park, we did our part by raising young falcons in special boxes called hack boxes and releasing these young falcons to the wild. But if, as a society, we didn't deal with the larger problem, which was the banning of chemicals like DDT, that problem never would have been fixed.
The park teams up with public and private industry and special interest groups to try to influence what goes on around it. But outside their boundaries, there's only so much they can do. While some challenges are bigger than the park itself, others are neatly contained within it. Located within a couple of hours' drive of New Brunswick's 3 largest cities, Fundy National Park is the go-to spot for many wanting a taste of the wilderness.
So they come to it for the camping, they come to it for the hiking, because the hiking here is considered to be rugged. The camping is a long time family tradition to come as a group with neighbors, cousins, extended family, set up together and have a good time together.
This park has all the amenities any major campground would offer, and then some. Many facilities found today were planned and built when the park was created in 1948. A saltwater pool, a playground, a 9-hole golf course. Attitudes surrounding national parks were different then than they are today.
This all happened during a period when Parks Canada were developing national parks for people to come to and to do various activities.
But over the years, Parks Canada's focus shifted. Their mandate went from trying to lure people into the wilderness to revitalizing natural areas to maximize its ecological health. The golf course is a prime example of this shift in attitude. Stanley Thompson, the world-renowned golf course architect, designed it around the time the park opened.
In his day, Stanley Thompson was considered to be an environmentalist in that he used the natural landscape features, the natural topography, and the natural vegetation that was in the area in his designs.
Dixon Brook runs through the golf course. It was in rough shape from its previous farmland days. Thompson thought he would fix it using stream management practices of the day.
During the construction of the golf course, this channel was narrowed and it was straightened, and it was actually relocated in order to create the long golf course fairways.
By doing so, he inadvertently increased how fast the water flowed. During heavy rainfall, floods occur quickly here. Dixon Brook and the makeshift guards Thompson set up to protect the riverbanks couldn't hold up against the force of floodwaters.
We have had 4 significant floods that have caused major damage to the golf course fairways, resulted in very costly repairs, and which of course caused ecological degradation of the stream itself.
For the park, it was time to look into a natural restoration of the brook.
What we really had was a brook that was not only ecologically degraded for fish and wildlife, but we also had a stream channel that was very unattractive to visitors. It was not the type of stream that you'd really expect to find in a national park facility.
This is what Dixon Brook looks like today. After many years of hard work, the section of the brook running through the golf course is now mostly restored.
So after we widened the channel and reshaped our banks, we put in these rock riffles. Now, what the riffles do is that they step the channel, which gradually reduces the slope of the brook. So during floods, the water velocity slows down and the bed and banks become more stable.
They still have more vegetation to plant along the banks, and they still need to get rid of a gravel bar blocking some fish from freely moving from the brook to the bay and vice versa. In time, this portion of Dixon Brook will act like a natural stream system, home to resident brook trout, birds, and small mammals. Although it's in a golf course, landlocked fish like the brook trout will be able to prosper. Ocean-bound fish like the eels and the salmon aren't as fortunate. Just like the peregrine, solving whatever is ailing them is going to require a lot more than the park can do by itself or with its partners.
We feel that we need to give it some time yet to better understand the problem in the ocean. But eventually, you know, as a society, we have to look at some of these issues and say, you know, when is enough enough?
Fundy National Park stands as a testament that recovery is possible. The inner bay of Fundy Atlantic salmon, though on life support, at least exists. The peregrine falcon, though still a threatened species, is no longer endangered. And the forests, though once heavily logged, are dense, lush, and full of life.
I guess the nice thing here about Fundy is proof that it can be done, and the incredible ability that the land does have to heal itself with, you know, just a little bit of help and, you know, and a lot of time in general. But, you know, and I think people should take heart from that, you know, that the earth does have an amazing capacity to heal itself, you know, if people take the time and the effort, you know, to help it along.